Good morning, everyone. It is now 9 o'clock, and I know some people are still joining the webinar, and I also am aware that some areas of Southwest Arkansas may be without power, and I've emailed some of them that this will be recorded as we've recorded other webinars, and it will be posted as soon as possible on ADE's website. You can access the handout on the same site where you access the Zoom link. Okay, today we have Alan Lytle joining us. Are you there, Alan?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. As we go throughout the presentation, if any of you have questions and answers, please post them in the Q&A box, and I will attempt to answer them during the webinar, or afterwards I will answer them by email. As I've stated in some other webinars in this series, after the entire series is concluded, I will post a frequently asked questions document that applies to all of the webinars in the series. Okay, today our agenda is to talk about avoiding unnecessary segregation, evaluating EL students for special ed services, providing special ed and ESOL services together, meeting the needs of opt-out EL students, documenting opt-out EL students, assessing opt-out EL students, and next steps that we have in this series, as well as a reminder about the Regional English Language Proficiency Standards workshop sessions. As a reminder, the information that's contained in this presentation and in ADE's ESOL program guidance document was derived from these two primary documents: Programs for English Language Learners from the Office for Civil Rights, and the January 7th, 2015 Dear Colleague letter that came from the U.S. Department of Justice and the Office for Civil Rights. Okay, our first topic for today is about avoiding unnecessary segregation. English learner programs may not unjustifiably segregate students on the basis of national origin or English learner status. However, they can require or may require English learner students to receive separate instruction for a limited period of time. This is dependent upon their educational program goals. It needs to be in the least segregated manner consistent with the program's educational goals. When the OCR or the Department of Justice has investigated districts in regards to this topic, it's rarely been justified to instruct English learner and non-English learner students in subjects like physical education, art, and music separately. Sorry, I left out the word separately. I'll fix that on the handout. It's also rarely justified to separate students during activity periods outside of instruction. That includes things like lunch, recess, assemblies, and extracurricular activities. When OCR or anyone is coming to determine whether or not the segregation is necessary, you need to determine if it's needed to achieve the goals of an educationally sound and effective English learner program. Part of the process of determining whether or not the segregation is necessary is to monitor student progress regularly. You should not keep ELs in an ESOL program longer or shorter than necessary to achieve your program's educational goals. Districts should not keep English learner students in English learner only classes for periods longer or shorter than required, and how you determine whether or not it's required is determined by each student's level of English proficiency. So your services may differentiate based on English proficiency level, as we discussed in the webinar about language acquisition programs. It may also be determined by their time and progress in the ESOL program. However, you should not have strict guidelines about an EL student can only be in your program 3 years or 4 years or 1 year. It should also be connected to their progress in the ESOL program. And you should keep in mind the stated goals of your ESOL program and what the purpose is of the program you have in place. To determine whether the degree of segregation is necessary, you should also offer entry and exit into the segregated ESOL program on a voluntary basis. That has to do with how you inform parents of the services and that parents have the right to decline those services. The program should be reasonably designed to provide English learner students comparable access to standard curriculum within a reasonable length of time. It should also answer the question about whether EL students have the same range and level of extracurricular activities and additional services as students in other environments. They should not be in a situation where they can't participate in extracurricular activities or other services just because of their English learner program. In order to determine what degree of segregation is necessary, you need to at least annually assess English proficiency and determine the appropriate level of language assistance services. You should also have established for your program valid and reliable exit criteria from ESOL services. What I mean by this particular use of exit criteria, this means the transition between level of services. So for example, if you have a newcomer program, which we'll talk about in just a minute, you need to have clear criteria for how you exit the newcomer program and go into the next level of services, which might be ESOL classes that are only 1 or 2 periods, for example. As I said, you can have a newcomer program. It does need to be voluntary, and it is usually for a limited duration of time. It is for a limited duration of time, usually a year, sometimes up to 2 years, depending on your exit criteria. It's acceptable if you schedule newcomer students with non-academic subjects like lunchtime or recess and other non-academic subjects if you schedule those with non-EL students. It's also acceptable if you encourage newcomer English learner students to participate in integrated after-school activities with non-EL students. It's also acceptable if you evaluate their English proficiency regularly to allow appropriate transitions out of the newcomer EL program throughout the academic year. In those regular appropriate transition times, it depends on the age level of your newcomer program. It could be at 6-week intervals, it could be a weekly interval check, it could be at the quarter, or it could be at the semester. Whatever is the most appropriate time to transition between the newcomer program and other services. Some issues that come up when addressing segregation are as follows, and we've already addressed some of this, but this is just a reminder that these are some examples of when the departments have found compliance issues involving segregation. If you fail to give segregated English learner students access to their grade level curriculum, special education, or extracurricular activities. Another compliance issue is if you segregate your English learner students for both academic and non-academic subjects, such as recess, physical education, art, and music. Another compliance issue is if you maintain students in a language assistance program longer than necessary to achieve the district's goals for the program. And another issue is if you place English learner students in more segregated newcomer programs due to perceived behavior problems or perceived special needs. In other words, on that last item, you cannot place a student in a newcomer program simply because they're having trouble adjusting to the regular classroom and are having behavior problems, or because you think they might have special education needs. So before we go on to the next topic, are there questions so far, Alan?
Yeah, here's one, and it's kind of long. So it says, will the ADE be providing specific guidelines for the levels of services students should be receiving, regardless of where they're going to school? Newcomers on some campuses are voluntarily in newcomer programs. What level of service are we required to provide the newcomer students who chose to attend their neighborhood school? Suggested guidelines are appreciated to ensure that we are fully meeting the needs of all ELs regardless of where they are attending schools. Variations also exist across districts in terms of what is available for newcomer students. Is there a standard we should be following regardless of our district resources?
Okay, this goes back to some of what we addressed in the prior, sorry about that, the prior webinar about program development and what your language acquisition program is. ADE will not specify a specific program or a specific kind of service that you must provide. What is required was addressed in the prior webinar. It needs to be research-based. And if you're going to do a newcomer program, for example, you need to follow the parameters that were set up for that newcomer program. In addition to that, when you're trying to determine whether or not it's an appropriate service, you have to evaluate whether your students are making progress and they are acquiring English in a timely fashion. If they're not making progress or attaining English in a timely manner, then you need to adjust your ESOL program appropriately. I know that many districts would like it if we could say this is how much time you should have in an EL program, this is the student-teacher ratio, etc. However, different types of EL program services require different types of staffing and student-teacher ratio and length of time in program. So, in other words, I don't think you will ever see us say that you have to follow a certain model or that you have to have a certain student-teacher ratio or a certain length of time in program. The requirement is that you provide an appropriate program and that you evaluate that regularly. So I hope that helps answer that question. It's probably not the answer the person was wanting to receive, but that's what the answer is. Okay, we'll move on about special education services. Now, I know this is a very hot topic. I get questions frequently about this. And the items in this webinar are just to have a common understanding of what the basics are about providing services. To actually do in-depth training about how all of this looks would require more than the hour that we have together today. So we will look at providing further training in conjunction with special ed so that professionals in special education and in English language acquisition will work together in providing appropriate services for dually identified students. So the first thing that we're going to address is that districts must ensure that all English learner students who may have a disability, like all other students who may have a disability and need services under IDEA or Section 504, that they are located, identified, and evaluated for special education and disability-related services in a timely manner. Timely manner is a key item here. We will address that in just a minute. When you're conducting such evaluations, districts must consider the English language proficiency of English learner students in determining the appropriate assessments and other evaluation materials to be used. Districts must not identify or determine that English learner students are students with disabilities solely because of their English language proficiency. That is totally inappropriate, that because they do not have full control of English, that they would be identified as a special education student. If you identify special education students who are English learners, you must provide the English learner students with disabilities both the language assistance and disability services to which they are entitled under federal law. You must also inform the parent of an English learner student that has an IEP or an individualized education program how the language instruction education program meets the objectives of the child's IEP. They need to work together, not separately. And sometimes you might hear people try to say that one program trumps the other program. There is no such thing as one program trumping another program. If a student is an English learner and has a disability, both programs must work together to best serve the individual needs of that student. However, that may look different, and it should look differently for each student as it is part of an individualized education program. You may not have a formal or informal policy of no dual services. In other words, you shouldn't have a policy of allowing students to receive EL services or special education services, but not both. You need to provide both services as long as the student is eligible for and would benefit from both services. You also may not have a policy of delaying disability evaluations of English learner students for special education and related services for a specified period of time based on their English learner status. I've had at least 2 districts email me and ask, is it true that you have to be in the United States for 3 years before we can evaluate a student for special education services if they're an English learner? That is not true. You may not have a policy that delays their evaluation simply because of their length of time being an English learner. I'll go back to that one more time. It's not addressed on the slide specifically, but this is where the response to intervention type process would be very beneficial. As any student who is struggling, whether it's an English learner or not, they should be in a response to intervention type process if they're struggling. You need to be documenting what you are attempting, the rate of progress that they are making, and if it's working, then it's working. And if it's not, then you have evidence that what you are providing is not helping the student. You need to keep trying different interventions. And if very little is working, then it may be appropriate to consider evaluation for a disability. Likewise, you may get a student in who perhaps has an obvious disability, or at least it appears obvious. Apparently I did not word that well. You do need to evaluate regularly and appropriately for obvious disabilities such as, Down syndrome, some other situations that come in where it's obvious that the student who might have come straight from another country has a disability or a potential disability. You don't delay that evaluation simply because they just arrived. Under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, you need to ensure that assessments and other evaluation materials used to evaluate a child with a disability are provided and administered in the child's native language or other mode of communication and in the form most likely to yield accurate information on what the child knows and can do academically, developmentally, and functionally, unless it is clearly not feasible to so provide or administer. This is another question I get a lot of. Do we have to assess the student in their native language for special education services? If we don't have access to a Hmong translation or a Hmong assessment, for example, if you're considering a disability for a Hmong student, one district asked, do we then not ever evaluate the student? No, you would evaluate the student then in English, but you need to interpret those results, understanding that it is not their primary language, that English is not. In that case, you just need to interpret the results carefully, but you do go ahead and assess in English if you absolutely cannot provide or administer the native language assessment. In addition, for those who are Spanish speaking, because that's our most common language in Arkansas. And there are Spanish language proficiency tests that we can provide to determine whether a child would most benefit from assessment in English or Spanish. The Spanish language proficiency test could also help determine how you need to interpret results from any assessments that you give the student. For example, if the child, we often find that children who are eventually qualifying for a specific learning disability, they may not be very proficient in English or Spanish, or their English may be stronger and they have lost a lot of the Spanish due to not receiving instruction in Spanish, which we are not able to do in Arkansas, or due to reduced use of Spanish at home. So in that case, it would be inappropriate to assess a child in Spanish because they would not know enough Spanish to benefit from a native language assessment in Spanish. You would then need to administer any assessments in English and interpret them knowing that English is their second language. Once you have identified a student with a disability, an IEP team needs to consider the language needs as those needs relate to the child's IEP. In order to do that, you must include someone who knows language needs and how to address them on your IEP team. Your IEP team needs to include ESOL trained professionals. The IDEA also requires the district to take whatever action necessary to ensure the parent understands proceedings of IEP meetings. For example, if the parent does not speak English proficiently, then the district is obligated to provide the appropriate interpreter for that parent so that they can understand what is going on at the IEP meeting. Okay, we have an example of related to IDEA. A teacher thinks that a Spanish-speaking English learner student with beginner-level English has a learning disability. She would like to have the student evaluated for a disability, but believes that the student must complete 1 year in the EL program or achieve intermediate proficiency in English before being evaluated for a disability or receiving special education and related services. She is incorrect. This is not a valid way of looking at this student. The principal explains to her that if she believes the student has a disability, the school district must seek parental consent for an initial evaluation, and once consent is granted, must evaluate the student in a timely manner. After the parent's consent, the district arranges for a bilingual psychologist to conduct the evaluation in Spanish, given the English learner student's ELP level and language background. Okay, before we continue, are there questions?
Yes, we have two.
Okay.
So the first one is, will there be specific guidance forthcoming on the interpretation of results for assessments given in English where a native language assessment is not available?
I will have to work with special education regarding that. I think it will be dependent upon the instrument you use and the parameters upon which that instrument was normed.
Okay. Then we have a second and a third question. The third one just came in. The second question is, how do we respond to SPED faculty who resist testing due to already filled quotas of minority students?
That might be a question that you need to talk to me individually about. However, you cannot decline or deny access to special education because of a quota system. I am aware of some districts needing to make sure they're not over or under identifying students, and we have to be wary of that as well. However, if a student is in need of evaluation, they have the right to be evaluated and considered for services. If you're having trouble in that area, please contact me independently.
And then here's the last question for right now. Can the ESOL trained professional serve as both interpreter and ESOL trained professional in IEP meetings?
That would be acceptable if the interpreter or the ESOL professional is very careful to make sure to interpret everything and not provide their understanding, not bias their interpretation, to strictly provide interpretation for the parent, not try to flavor what they are interpreting. If at all possible, it would be best to have an independent interpreter. However, I realize that in many districts, that's not possible, and the minimum requirement is that you do provide an interpreter. Okay, we will go on. Okay, Section 504 is another part of special education, and if you're going to provide a Section 504 evaluation, it must measure whether an English learner student has a disability and not just reflect the student's lack of proficiency in English. You must administer any evaluations under this in an appropriate language to avoid misclassification, and you should gather appropriate information about a student's previous educational background, including language-based interventions when considering a 504. For that matter, you should do that for an IDEA. There are guiding questions that can help you with SPED and EL issues. They are on page 44 of the ESOL program guidance document. I'm not going to go over those right now because they are very similar to what we've already been talking about, but it's wording, it's some questions you can ask yourself, or you can share elements of the program guidance document with other staff in your district so that you can all be working together to define what it is you're doing for special ed and English learners. Some compliance issues that come up when you're evaluating English learner students for IDEA or Section 504, or when you deny English language services to English learner students with disabilities. So if you identify a student and they're in special ed, and then you say, well, because they're in special ed, they do not get ESOL services, that is totally inappropriate to just blanketly deny those services. If you evaluate English learner students for special education services only in English, when the native and dominant language of the EL student is other than English. However, if it's totally unfeasible to evaluate them in their native language, then you need to make sure you are interpreting the other assessments that you do in English appropriately. If you fail to include staff qualified in English learner instruction and second language acquisition in placement decisions under IDEA or 504, you could be in a compliance issue situation. Or if you fail to provide interpreters to LEP parents at IEP meetings to ensure that they understand the proceedings. So make sure that when you are defining what you do for special education students who are English learners, that you address each of these items to avoid finding yourself in a non-compliance situation. Are there any more questions on this topic before we move on?
None of them that have been sent in, but I have a question about number 4 on the screen that you're showing.
Okay.
For the interpreters, does a school or district have to provide an interpreter every time or only when a parent requests it?
They need to offer one every time, even if the parent doesn't request it. You need to determine if the parent is in need of one. Part of the initial home language survey, and then you need to have an annual way of determining this. You need to determine what language the parent wants to have information. In addition to that, this can go both ways. If you have a suspicion that the parent is not understanding what you are saying in English, then in order to protect yourself, your district, it would behoove you to provide an interpreter. However, if the parent refuses to use the interpreter or asks the interpreter to quit talking, that they can do it all themselves in English. As long as you've attempted to provide it, you are fine. Does that answer your question, Alan?
Yep. Thanks.
Okay. One toolkit that you may want to look at on the OELA website, that's the Office of English Language Acquisition. They do have a toolkit online, and when you see this document, when you have the handout, this is a hyperlink. Chapter 6 of the toolkit is specifically about working with English learners who may have disabilities. A section in there that I thought was very beneficial, but we don't have time to go over today, has to do with trying to differentiate between a language difference due to second language acquisition and indicators of a possible learning disability. And in this tool, they go through several different areas. This one is showing for oral comprehension and listening what the differences could be. For example, if the student needs frequent repetition of oral directions and input, if the student's able to understand verbal directions in their first language but not the second language, well, then that's a language difference due to language acquisition. But if the student often forgets directions or needs further explanation, whether you're doing it in the first language or the second language, that means both at home and at school, well, that may be due to an auditory memory difficulty or low cognition. So this chart I thought was very beneficial and will help you when you're trying to determine whether some learning behaviors that you're seeing of your students, if they're due to language acquisition or if they're possibly due to a learning disability. So I would encourage you to look at that toolkit and to share this resource with your classroom teachers and with those who are evaluating your language learners for potential disabilities. Okay, our next topic, or our final one actually for today, is about meeting the needs of English learner students who opt out. As we've discussed previously, but we're going to go in more depth, parents have a right to decline or opt their children out of the school district's ESOL program or out of particular ESOL services within an ESOL program. On this one, for example, some districts may have a program that they offer during the school year and another program or service that they offer in the summer. And the parent may say, I do not want the child in the program that's offered during the school year, but I do want them to receive the service offered during the summer. That is acceptable and in fact required that they can opt out of one or both services. They may choose which services to participate. Another example here, they may choose to enroll their child in ESOL English classes, but decline to enroll their child in EL-only sheltered content classes. I know some districts provide ESOL English, ESOL Algebra, ESOL History, and the parent may say, I only want the child in ESOL English and I want them in regular content classes, and that is acceptable. In other words, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing approach. School districts may not recommend that parents decline all or some services within an ESOL program for any reason, including facilitating scheduling of special education services or other scheduling reasons. So if you're having difficulty making your schedule work, or you don't have enough ESOL staff to service all your students, you may not encourage or recommend that parents decline services to meet your scheduling needs or scheduling challenges. You may also, if a teacher doesn't agree with the overall LPAC's decision about a child's EL level, for example, the teacher may not say, well, if you just go in and decline services, then you won't have to be in that class. That is inappropriate, and school districts should take steps to prevent that from happening. And that may involve educating the teachers about the benefits of the program, but then also gathering their concerns and asking them to address that during an LPAC meeting and not directly with the parent by encouraging declining services. A parent's decision to opt out of an ESOL program or particular ESOL services must be knowing and voluntary. In order to be knowing and voluntary, you must provide guidance in language that parents can understand to ensure that they understand their child's rights, the range of ESOL services that their child could receive, and the benefits of such services before voluntarily waiving them. You need to document that you have done this. So how you document that, OCR does consider whether that decision to opt out was knowing and voluntary. So you need to have some kind of documentation of their decision and whether the parent signed such documentation. Whatever you have them sign, you may also have written out in there a description of the benefits of an ESOL program, or what services were specifically declined and what ones were accepted, so that you have everything documented as to why and what they opted out of. If a student's parents have waived services, then in eSchool, you need to document the date that the parent signed the form waiving ESOL services for the student. It is in the field called ESOL waived services date, and at any time, the parent may request services again, and if so, then you remove the ESOL waived services date. Now, a question you may have is, what if they've waived services of part of the program but not all of the program? You need to keep track of that at the district level. Go ahead and put a waived services date if they have declined any of your services. Even when students' parents have declined EL services, you are still obligated as a district to meet their needs appropriately. They still retain their status as an English learner. It isn't as if the parent can say, I decline services and you're not going to identify them as an English learner, you're not going to have anything to do with my child as an English learner. Parents can't do that. They can only decline services. The district must still take the appropriate action required by the Equal Educational Opportunity Act to provide these English learner students access to its educational programs. We'll talk about that in just a minute. You must periodically monitor the progress of your opt-out students, just as you monitor the progress of your students who are still receiving direct services. And you must offer parents opportunities to enroll the student in ESOL services at any time. A good time to do that is if a student is struggling and you're determining that it's probably related to their language needs, then a parent-teacher conference, you may offer the opportunity to re-enroll in ESOL services. However, they still have the right to decline them. Even if the student is struggling and the parents have declined services, you must take affirmative and appropriate steps to provide access to meaningful curriculum. One way to do this is to provide adequate training to the opt-out English learner students' general education teachers on second language acquisition and English language development, because they can be structuring their lessons and their instruction and assessment to be responsive to the second language acquisition and ELD needs of a student without providing direct services. This is just good quality instruction that responds to the needs of the learners in their classroom. Regarding assessing English learner students who opt out EL students must have their English language proficiency assessed at least annually to gauge their progress in attaining English proficiency and to determine if they are still in need of and legally entitled to ESOL services. So in other words, I know we just finished the ALPA 21 testing window recently. The students who have declined services should have been assessed with ALPA 21, even though they're not receiving services. So there is no assessment exemption for students who do not receive ESOL services. Here's an example of meeting the needs of an opt-out student. A student is tested and determined to be an English learner student. The parent initially refuses ESOL program services because the parent believes her child speaks fluent English. After the first quarter, the student's teacher contacts the parent to discuss that the English learner student is struggling with reading and writing assignments despite her strong English speaking skills. The teacher offers a period of English language development and sheltered content classes, explaining how both can improve the student's proficiency in reading and writing. The parent accepts the English language development services and agrees to reevaluate the placement at the end of the school year. So that would be a way you could meet the needs of your opt-out students. And notice that when the parent agreed to services, they only agreed to the ELD part, not the sheltered part. Another example, at the beginning of the school year, a kindergarten student is tested and determined to be an English learner. The parent declined Title III and English language services that were offered in segregated classes attended by English learner students only. Although the student's parents opted the child out of ESOL-specific services, the school recognizes that the student continues to struggle in English. The school responds by training the kindergarten teacher to use ELD strategies in the EL student's regular integrated classroom. So the teachers can still use the strategies that work with English learners in the integrated classroom and not be in violation of the parent declining services. There are guiding questions that you can ask yourself as a district as you're determining the plan that you have for addressing your opt-out students, and they're on page 47 of the ESOL program guidance document. Some compliance issues that come up when meeting the needs of opt-out EL students are as follows. OCR and the Department of Justice past investigations have found high numbers of English learner students whose parents have opted them out of ESOL programs or particular services within an ESOL program due to problematic district practices such as school personnel steering families away from ESOL programs or providing incorrect or inadequate information to parents about the ESOL program, particular services within the program, or their child's EL status. So you need to make sure that you are not steering them away from your program and that you provide correct and adequate information about their program and the services you have, and that you're providing correct and adequate information about the child's English learner status. For example, how they're performing in listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and to help educate the parent on it's not enough just to speak English well, you also need to be able to read and write it well. OCR and the Department of Justice have also found noncompliance when school personnel have recommended families decline ESOL programs due to insufficient space in such programs, or because school districts served only English learner students with a basic or emerging level of English. Districts must provide ESOL services up until the time that a child qualifies to be reclassified as fluent English proficient, and you need to define what those services are for your district and offer them up until the time they exit. So you may not ask a family to decline services simply because the student is beyond the basic or emerging level of English. Parents have also been found to have opted their children out of ESOL programs because the school district did not adequately address parental concerns expressed about the quality of the ESOL program. Their lack of confidence in the ESOL program offered because the school district was not able to demonstrate the effectiveness of its program, or their belief that their child did not need ESOL services. So you are obligated to explain why the child needs ESOL services, or that if the effectiveness of your program is insufficient and students are not making progress, then you need to address that as a program, and you need to show the parent how you're addressing that. So it is important that if a parent has concerns, that you address those concerns. So Alan, are there questions at this point?
Yeah, we currently have 3 questions. So the first one is, parents sometimes threaten legal action when they have waived services. Is there a notice the ADE can provide for districts in writing for parents who want to make threats and consume inordinate amounts of time wanting to make their points about non-participation?
What I would suggest you do is you could share this section of the handbook with them about meeting the needs of opt-out students. In addition, you may also refer them to me if they're getting to that point. Try to work up through your chain of command at your district, that you are addressing it within your district to the best of your ability. But feel free to either you reach out to me or encourage the parent to, and I can help you case by case.
Okay. Second question is, are there any state-specific forms to use in EL conferences?
No, there are not state-specific forms for English learner conferences at this time. There are a couple of forms on the website that are sample forms for a home language survey or for an exiting form. I will be working on, and I have been working on, a live binder that will provide samples of forms that a district could use in their EL program. However, you need to make sure that the forms reflect what you are providing as an ESOL program. But we will be providing some sample ones that you can consider, but we will not be providing required forms at this time.
Okay, then the last question that we have is, your example refers to a kindergarten student whose parent refused segregated classes and ESOL services. How are you differentiating a segregated class versus a mainstream class where ESOL services are delivered?
Okay, if ESOL services, I assume what you're asking here is that they're delivered within the mainstream classroom. If they are integrated into instruction, then they're integrated into instruction, and that may or may not be sufficient to be your entire ESOL program for kindergarten. That might be a question you need to refer to me independently. I know that in the past, some districts have thought that, well, all kids in kindergarten are learning language, and if we just provide the teachers with English language development training and they just integrate that into the classroom, into all instruction for all students, then that's a sufficient ESOL program. That may or may not be sufficient. You need to have research to back up that being a program. A lot of the research we have talked about in regards to programming is that you do need to have some form of English language development in addition to providing mainstream instruction that has appropriate scaffolds provided for English learners. So that may not have answered that person's question, but I'd be glad to address individual concerns separately. Any other questions, Alan?
That's it for now.
Okay. Well, our final webinar in this series is on Thursday, April 21st. And in that webinar, we will be talking about the process of exiting and monitoring students, meaningful communication with LEP parents, and program evaluation. And that program evaluation is a key component for you determining whether or not you are sufficiently providing a program that meets the needs of your students and can potentially impact what you're doing on the other parts of the program that we have addressed up to this point. I also want to make sure that everyone is aware of the regional English language proficiency standards workshop sessions that are coming up this summer. There is a commissioner's memo that has all the details about the training, and it is hyperlinked on the handout. The 6 sites are listed on this slide with the dates. You are eligible, you may attend any site regardless of whether or not you're a member of that particular cooperative. We could not afford to bring in the national trainer to all 15 cooperatives, but we are bringing them into this 6. It is set up as a trainer of trainers model, and you're encouraged to send a team to the training, because these standards are meant for ESOL teachers, but they are also meant for regular classroom teachers who are delivering instruction to English learners. We will be showing how the English language proficiency standards are set up, how they can be used to help differentiate instruction for English learners in English language arts, literacy, mathematics, science, and how regular classroom teachers can use the standards to help them design appropriate lessons for different levels of English learners that they have. Participants will leave the presentation or the training with materials to facilitate training back in their districts with more teachers, and will also have access to an online portal with the national trainer for 2 years. And this national portal, we will include, it's specific to Arkansas, and we will include information in there specific to the needs of Arkansas, and it will be set up in such a way that you can ask for support from the national trainer. We may offer additional webinars or workshops depending on the needs of districts over the next 2 years. We will also be identifying 8 to 10 people throughout the state who may potentially help the department offer this training to other districts or at other cooperatives over the next couple of years as contract consultants with us. So if you want to be considered for that, you need to make sure you have attended this summer's presentation and that you implement the standards and work on training teachers in your own district as well. Are there any other questions at this point, Alan?
Nope, we don't have any more.
Okay, well, I want to thank, I did have 2 more announcements. One is that the deadline for the ESL Graduate Academy is this Friday. Please encourage teachers who you would like to have an English as a second language or ESOL endorsement, encourage them to sign up for that Graduate Academy. In addition, the EL Achieve Symposium, that's June 1 and 2 in Springdale, please consider registering for that. This is a program that may help a district identify how they can help support English language development in their district through the ELD program, and how they may support access to meaningful content through Constructing Meaning, which is a model designed to train teachers how to identify the language demands of a content lesson and then address those demands within their lesson. I will send out information about both of those later today to make sure you have that if you need to share with anybody in your district. So as always, we are here to help serve you. Please feel free to contact myself, Miguel, or Alan regarding any needs that you have for your English learners in your district, and we'll do our best to answer those or to find the answer together. So if there aren't any more questions, we will wrap this up, and I thank you for attending today.